we're busy looking at topics that are related to our second video that we did on the image of God on the relational view. If you haven't watched that video already, I'd recommend that you go watch it and then come back here to listen to what we're discussing about in this topic. So this particular video, we're going to be looking at the question of men and women and how they together bear the image of God.
So to do that, we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 11. So I'm going to give that a read, and then we can think about that together. Now I commend you, because you remember me in everything, and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or to shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. This is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Here ends the reading.
So just to make it clear why we're looking at this passage, one of the verses that I pulled out in the talk was Genesis 1 verse 27, where we see that both males and females are created in the image of God. And yet, and so from that you draw the conclusion that we're all equally in the image of God, and that's actually a point I made in the talk. But then here in verse 7, we hear him saying, "For man ought not cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man." So on the face of it, that seems to be saying something different to what is being said in Genesis 1.
Yeah, that's really weird, kind of bordering on offensive.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And what makes it even more confusing is that it seems that Genesis is sort of underlying the reasoning, because it's talking about man being made first and woman being made for man, which the argument probably doesn't mean something like woman's made to be a slave of man, but more like, Adam was alone, and so woman was made to complete him. But either way, it's like, okay, so you have the Genesis passage under the reasoning, but then you're saying something that seems so obviously against what the Genesis passage is trying to convey. It's just very strange.
It's very strange.
Now, the difficulty with this is that this particular verse, as you said, Matt, comes in the context of this passage that is so difficult to understand on its own terms. And I'm sure you could probably get that just from reading it. I don't know. I don't know if your voice was just struggling to but it sounded like you were like, what? What is he saying now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I definitely felt that way.
Yeah. There's so many things that are difficult about this passage, and it's not difficult because it's controversial. It's difficult just because it's it's not it can't even get to controversy yet, with the difficulty, because we don't know what some of the words, how they should be translated, particularly the word head, which is a pretty key one, or the word nevertheless in verse 9. We don't really know how that should be translated. We also don't know whether he's talking about the women wearing hats or shawls over their head, or whether he's talking about them having long hair or short hair. We don't know how to reconstruct the logic of his argument that makes it all coherent of the argument. We don't know. There's just some phrases that are so confusing at all. Because of the angels, he just added in there, or he started the passage saying, "I commend you in every way" or something, and then he goes on to criticize them. There's just lots of things like that.
Seems like there's a lot we don't know.
So much, and with most things, there's lots of opinions or like positions that have been put out there, but like even people are like sort of fall on the same side of, you know, one of the million debates will like disagree with each other. So it's not even like super clear, you know, like what we're supposed to do there. It's one of
Yeah.
those very, very confusing passages.
Great. So let's make sense of it.
Yeah, actually, so we should add one extra thing because this is going to make a lot of sense when we get to it in a second. One other thing that makes this particularly difficult is the book that we're in, is 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul has this habit of quoting a letter that the Corinthians had written to him. So he'll quote bits of it. Sometimes he'll start a quote and then he'll like add in his own thoughts, and then he'll continue the quote, or sometimes he'll like paraphrase the reasoning behind the quote. So in a few other cases earlier on in the book, you know, many translations will add like quotation marks to indicate where there's a general amount of agreement that Paul is quoting the Corinthian discourse or the Corinthian letter that they had written to him.
Although what's tricky about those quotation marks is that we don't have any, you know, explicit evidence of that in the Greek. The Greek didn't use quotation marks. It didn't
100%.
work like English does. So we can get that he's quoting from them, but where the quotations start and end, well, we've got to work that out from context. So you'll actually see that, say, the ESV and the NIV, they disagree on where the quotation marks should be sometimes, and I think some translations just don't have them at all.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember exactly, but I think we do know he does this because at least in some cases he says, you know, now regarding what you said, and then he'll say something.
So
but
context does make it pretty clear.
Yeah, well, but then other times we don't have that, right?
Yeah.
So he just, you know, he's already early in the letter he establishes the pattern of him quoting their letter and responding, and so by the time you get, you know, further on, he just quotes them and responds, and that's confusing to us, as you say, because like the Greek doesn't have any quotation marks in it. But it wouldn't have been confusing to the Corinthians because they would have known the letter that they wrote to him. So it would have been really clear to them which bits were being quoted and which bits weren't being quoted. I think also, unfortunately, even if we could get like agreement on certain things, this passage is obviously also addressing or touching on a more hotly debated issue in Christianity between complementarianism and egalitarianism, right? Which see like an asymmetry between men and women in certain relationships, whether it be in the marriage or in the church life, versus whether you don't see any difference between them. And so not only are these difficult questions to answer on their own terms, but now people are bringing in their baggage when reading the passage, and so we have to try and get rid of that as well, which is just makes the whole thing even more complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like there are a lot of big debates, and we're not pretending that we can solve them all here. But yeah, there are still things that we can say. So what do we learn from this passage?
So obviously we're most interested in verse 7, right? Which is the bit that says, let me just get it up here. A man ought not cover his head since he is the image and the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man.
Right.
That's sort of, right? So like definitely one way you can interpret that is by saying men participate in the image of God more fully than women, right? Although that wouldn't be very consonant with what we see in Genesis, which doesn't make any distinction between men and women in that regard. They're put there in the same thing, and there's no like qualifications or caveats added. It's just like, no, humanity as a whole bears the image of God. It also kind of, as I just said that, you know, we were talking in the talk about the horizontal aspect where humanity together bears the image of God. It's not so much that we each are our own image of God. And since men and women are equally human, you would think that that they equally bear the image of God.
If I'm not mistaken, the idea of men being more truly the image of God is a view that was taken in church history. That there are a whole lot of people, a whole lot of theologians that kind of jumped on that bandwagon, and it's quite a scary thought to that for at least a chunk of church history, there were a lot of people thinking that that's what this verse means. And I think it's really important to emphasize that that's very far away from the truth.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's quite unfortunate. It seems like what they did is they kind of didn't spend much time on the oh well, they didn't like they spent more time trying to explore that idea than question whether it was justified exegetically by the passage.
Yeah.
Which is it's super unfortunate and not at all what we think or what we think the Bible teaches. Yeah, I don't really know what to say other than apologize on their behalf.
Yeah, we definitely want to distance ourselves from that reading. It is unfortunate, to put it lightly.
And that's not just because we're sensitive to that in a modern context. It's
No.
I mean, it's our reading of Genesis that is the thing. So
yeah.
So if we're thinking, so in order to really get at verse 7, we have to think about views of the passage as a whole, because that will inform what's going on in verse 7. So if we were to start by categorizing views that about the passage as a whole, so verse 2 to verse 16, I think the first big division that we'd have to make is whether we see one voice in the passage or two voices in the passage. So whether it's all just Paul and he's just writing one coherent argument, or whether he is doing what he's done elsewhere in the letter, where he's quoting bits of the Corinthian discourse and then interjecting with his own thoughts, sometimes sarcasm, and so on, right? Because that would impact quite drastically, the kinds of questions that we would have to bring to verse 7 particularly. Now, it wouldn't be ad hoc to suggest that, as we've said, because he already does this elsewhere in the letter. So it's definitely this one voice versus two voice question is a question unique to 1 Corinthians. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one. The translation that I'm looking at, which I think is an ESV still, doesn't have any quotation marks. That's not a problem because of what we were saying earlier, that's judged mainly by context. But it is an interesting suggestion. So what do we make of it? What would be what the Corinthians have to say, and what are Paul's responses here?
Yes. Okay. So good question. So I want to say that the particular answer I'm going to give here is inspired by a work by Lucy Peppiatt. Her book called Woman and Worship in Corinth, Paul's Rhetorical Arguments in 1 Corinthians. It's a really great discussion of this. Most of the book is taken up discussing chapter 11. There's a somewhat similar debate to be had in chapter 14, but it's slightly different. Yeah, so the reason I mentioned that is, the reason I mentioned Lucy Peppiatt is because, depending on which author you're talking to, they'll give you like a different carving up of when Paul is speaking versus when the Corinthians are speaking. So now, also, I say paraphrasing because I don't have her work directly in front of me. So this is mainly going off what I remember her saying. So on her reading, you would break it up like this. You would say, cool, Paul in the beginning is saying, yes, I commend you. So verse 2 is Paul, I commend you for doing your best, basically, to remember the kind of stuff that I taught you. So Paul had taught the Corinthians that that the head of every man is Christ and the head of a wife is a husband. What we mean by head there is up for debate, but we're not talking about that right now, so we're gonna leave it to one side. The problem is that the Corinthians had taken that mantra or that principle that the head of every man is Christ and the head of a wife is a husband, and they'd like taken it too far, and they imposed too strict regulations on woman worship that Paul doesn't really think is correct. And so in verse 3, he adds onto this bit that the Corinthians are quoting back at Paul, his own teaching. He adds, and the head of Christ is God. Just to emphasize the fact that this notion of headship isn't something like supreme servitude or something like that, because you have Christ and God in that same relationship. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah. So it's this comparison that seems to be going on between the husband and the wife and Christ and God to kind of give a bit of control there. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so they basically took he taught something like that, or what exactly the word head means is up for debate, but let's just leave it as head for now. Yeah. So he taught something like the head of every man is Christ and the head of the wife is a husband, meaning a particular thing by the word head, right?
Yeah.
They had taken it and gone like in a direction that he was not comfortable with. And so he's quoting that back at them, being like, yes, that's true. It's good that you're trying to like work out what that means in practice. But clearly you've gone wrong. So then he adds the qualifier, like, oh, and the head of Christ is God, to make sure that we don't go off in that.
Bring them back
direction.
on track.
Bring them back on track, exactly. So that's the beginning of him interjecting in the thing. That explains, by the way, this weird order that you have here. Because if you're writing the whole thing and not quoting bits of it, you would expect him to say something like, the head of Christ is God, the head of man is Christ, and the head of the wife is the husband or something. But he kind of goes like middle one, Christ to man, and then like man to husband to wife, and then he jumps up again in a different order. So it's a bit strange. But if he's quoting there a lesson that he's given them and they're quoting back at him and so on, then it kind of makes sense that he's adding in this qualifier to explain what's going on. So then he starts quoting them. So I believe it's from verse 4 to verse 4 and verse 5 is the Corinthian discourse. So they're basically saying, they're giving their argument for why men should either have short hair or should not wear head coverings, and women should. Now, whether it's a woman, again, our translation, whether it's a woman or a wife, that's a question that we're not going to get into. But so there he's quoting them, right? So and they're kind of giving their reasoning for that in the beginning of their reasoning in verses 4 and 5. And then in verse 6, he's actually doing... actually, it would be verse... Oh, yeah, that's right. In verse 6, he's filling in. So it's back to Paul now. He's filling in their reasoning, but kind of in a way that's showing that it's absurd. Which, it hadn't occurred to me, but it is actually kind of an absurd kind of reasoning. Or it could be interpreted as a sort of absurd reasoning. So they're basically saying, okay, a woman should pray or prophesy with her head covered because otherwise she'll dishonor it. And it's the same as if we're shaven. And he's like, what? And then, so he kind of reconstructs the argument like, oh yeah, it would be shameful for a woman to pray without a head covering. So what she should do is shave her head. But that would be shameful. And we want to avoid that. So what she should have really have done is just put a head covering on. And it's like, what? Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
So he's kind of saying like, oh yeah, they should do this shameful. If they did the shameful thing, they should do this other shameful thing. But that's shameful. So they shouldn't do the first thing. And then put that, it's like, okay. So in phrasing it like he does in verse 6, he's sort of just trying to draw out the silliness of their argument. He has been a bit like this in 1 Corinthians already. Earlier in the letter, when he's been criticizing them, he says something like, but who are we to speak? You're kings compared to us.
Yeah.
So
Chapter 4, he's very sarcastic.
Yeah. So this, again, isn't something that we're just postulating to make sense of this passage. It is already something we have evidence for in the letter. The tone of the letter is something that is open to the sort of ridiculousness, I guess.
Yeah.
So he does that just to like as an aside to like kind of show the silliness of their reasoning. Then he continues with their reasoning, right? So this is now the Corinthian argument from verses 7 to verses 10. So they're giving these two arguments. For a man ought not to cover his head because he's the image of the glory of God. The woman is the glory of man. And their reasoning, the reason they say that is because man came first and woman came from man. And then woman was created for man. So those are the two supporting reasons in verse 8 and 9 that they give for their claim that man is the image and glory of God, whereas woman is just the glory of man. And then there's this bit about the angels. We're not going to get into that. There's a whole lot of literature around what that, because of the angels, could possibly mean. Thankfully, it's not relevant to our purposes here. So that's their reasoning. And so for Paul, on this reading, he starts in verse 11 again saying, nevertheless, or the point is this. This is what you should really be taking away from what's going on from all of this. That in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. All things are from God. So he's arguing for a level of equality there, right? He's saying, yeah, it's true that Eve was made from Adam's side, so woman came from man. But conversely, or equally, men are now born from their mothers. And so everything comes from God. And so in the woman, in the Lord, neither is independent of the other. And so he's basically getting at the reasoning that they're giving in verses 8 and 9 and saying you can't draw the conclusion that you do in verse 7, namely that only man is in the image of God and not woman. you see that? Does
Yeah.
that make sense what I'm saying? Yeah.
That makes so much more sense of what's going on, because it seemed like a very strange back and forth between, well, woman came from man, and then to go on to say, well, it's kind of both ways. Having
Yeah.
those two voices there actually does help to tease apart what's going on there in a really
Yeah.
helpful way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the tricky thing, I mean, again, every verse is laden with trickiness, but the word for nevertheless in ESV in the beginning of verse 11, that's a fairly tricky one to translate. It's not like, yeah, we're not entirely clear what it is. So I think Lucy Peppier suggests that based on its other usages, which are all in Philippians, I believe, the sense of it is like, this is the point that you're supposed to take out of this is the point, right? And then he's arguing for it. So if Paul were talking in verses 7 to 10, sorry, and then he says, this is the point, and then he says something that sounds completely the opposite. It's sort of a weird phrasing. It's sort of a weird way of reasoning. Like, actually, it's not clear at all what he would be saying then. The two voice reading does give a very natural reading to it. Even if you have the word nevertheless there, it's also similar, because it's sort of saying, well, yes, but on the other hand, you should realize that there's this other kind of way that you could reason about this that would be clearer.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if I said that very clearly, but hopefully you got my point.
I was following. I hope I listened.
Cool. And so then the key thing is that Paul is drawing the conclusion in verse 12 that seems to be opposite to the reasoning that was drawn in verse 7, namely, all things are from God. So there's this equality now between them. Everyone is coming from God. You can't have this weird thing where you're saying, like, men are from God, but women are from men, and so it's like this weird thing. I can't remember quite what goes on with judge for yourselves, but I think it's sort of like he's sort of pushing them to make a decision. Let's like make a decision here. He's not like disinterested in their conclusion, right? So that's not how you should read that. I don't think. You should. It's sort of like him pushing them to be like, listen, you need to see this. And then in verse 14 and 15, he's sort of giving another supporting argument that would be reasoning from the way that they would have thought as Corinthians. So when he talks about does not nature itself teach that, as I understand it, that would be like how they would have reasoned. Like he's using a premise that they would have already accepted, that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace to him, but if a woman wears long hair, it's to her glory. And then he kind of says, okay, but that means then that her long hair has been given as a covering already. So you don't need to force another covering on her. That's sort of the idea there.
Yeah.
So it's like an ancillary argument he's appealing to premises that they would have already accepted and drawing the same conclusion that we don't have to worry about that stuff. And then the last verse is saying, if anyone's inclined to be contentious, so like disagree with me, then you should just realize that nowhere else do we practice this thing that you want to impose upon the woman, namely that they should wear these head coverings and the men not. So that would be the sort of reconstruction from it's, as I say, it's inspired by Peppier because I'm not quoting her directly. I would recommend reading the book if you're more interested in going into that reading more in depth. But on that reading, it's very clear then that verse 7 is saying what it's saying on the face value, namely that men are in the image of God and women aren't, but it's not what Paul is teaching, it's what Paul's responding to and objecting to in verses 11 and 12.